Now the floor is yours.
Okay, nice job staying around. Good morning, everyone. This is a marathon, I know, particularly for those of us who arrive sometime on Wednesday or maybe even earlier. But it's such a delight to be here and to be joined by these esteemed speakers. My day job is Director for Political Security Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute, as well as serving as Deputy Director to the woman to my right. So we are Washington creatures all here. I feel like this conversation would have been a lot different if we'd had it a month ago. I think it's almost exactly a month ago that the U.S. and Japan secured a trade deal. It was previous to that was feeling like there was a bit of a crisis in the relationship. But this panel is going to sort of unpack where we are right now, prospects moving forward. This is a good time to take notes. We have some really serious experts here. And I just also want to mention, I'm so grateful to David for hosting this conference. And although I'm, been in Washington for so long now, I'm an Appalachian myself, coming from West Virginia, so it's feeling really nice to be back in this region. So the panelists here today are well known, I think, to all of you. Wendy Cutler is the Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And Tong, you all know, is managing partner at the Asia Group, as well as obviously just stepped down as chair of the board here. So let's just get into sort of the baseline here of where we stand. And I'm going to turn to Wendy first to give us an assessment of this U.S. trade deal that was announced almost exactly a month ago. What are the aspects of it that surprised you, or aspects of the timing that took you by surprise?
Okay. Yeah. Well, first, let me just say I'm just honored to be here. I think it was about 8 years ago I attended my first NAJAS conference, and let me tell you, it was a lot smaller, so kudos to everyone. I mean, this is amazing. I'm also a bit intimidated by sitting on the panel with the incoming and outgoing presidents of this organization. Hopefully no one's going to look to draft me to do anything for this group, but but yeah, so yes, great question, Emma, and there's so much to unpack. Let me just start and say I've negotiated trade agreements now for about 3 decades, and the negotiations that are underway now between partners all over the world and the Trump administration are very, very different than the talks I worked on during my career. In what respects? Don't get me started, but number one, when we negotiated trade deals, they were two-way, right? So countries made concessions, and we also made concessions. And why this was so important was because then those agreements would be like win-win agreements, and the other countries could take them home and gain domestic support. Now look, with Japan for many years, they were one-sided, but they really didn't work. And that's kind of one of my major takeaways. For lasting trade agreements, they need to be kind of win-win. Second, when we negotiated trade agreements, the Japanese delegation would come to the US, and then we would go to Tokyo. And frankly, sometimes in these agreements, we'd meet in Hawaii the third time, but we would call that kind of the neutral area because we both wanted to go there. But in this negotiation, you're seeing these ministers, and I think of Minister Akazawa, who's, I don't even know what his frequent flyer miles are like, but he was coming to Washington almost every week to continue negotiations. And my sense is sometimes he'd only have an hour or 2 of meetings, but would be going back and forth, shuttling back and forth. Third, the involvement of our leader, our president, just kind of unprecedented. And so you could be negotiating with ministers, like many countries found out, only to go to the White House and to find out that there was another request, or some of the major concessions you made he didn't really care about. And so this is, and also a very kind of different dynamic. But all that said, we reached a framework deal with Japan. As far as I know, there's nothing jointly in writing, and that's another kind of key difference for me to negotiate a deal and not to have something in writing just leads to difference in interpretations. And that's exactly what we've seen coming out of the announcement made between the U.S. and Japan, whether it's with respect to and we can get into this, the investment fund that was announced. And, I think of this picture of Minister Akazawa, and I think Ambassador Yamada was also in the Oval Office, and there's some, there's a whiteboard up there, and the investment fund's like at $350 billion, and then 10 minutes later it's crossed out and it's $450 billion, and I'm just thinking, if I'm there, I'm thinking like, can I take a bathroom break and just leave this room before the number keeps going up more and more? But there are a lot of, my sense is there's really a difference in views on how this fund is going to be administered and what this fund actually is. Second, I think, serious differences on what was agreed to on this LNG Alaska project. Japan's using the words like explore and potential, and our president is talking about a joint venture that has already been established. And finally, and probably kind of the most immediate, I think, worry on behalf of Japan, frankly, is when the auto tariff reductions are going to go into effect. They were agreed upon, Akazawa came back, they were reaffirmed, but Japan is waiting for an executive order to be issued. It has not been issued, as far as I know, to bring the auto tariffs down to 15%, like they are with the EU. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Wendy. Leave it to Wendy to lay it all out. Actually, if I could just follow up on that, though. I mean, it does seem like as the deals have continued to roll out, that the deal with Japan did sort of establish that 15% as a bit of a baseline, or maybe the best that you can do. So how, in your view, at least, how does the Japan's trade deal compare to the others that have been unveiled since?
So far, so good. I think Japan did as well as anyone else. The EU this deal was just a joint statement between the U.S. and EU was released yesterday. A lot more details, and so I'll have to look at what a joint statement between the U.S. and Japan looks like to really compare, but I think it's pretty much in line with what the EU got. The EU may say in certain areas it got more, but again, I would also caution everyone that my sense is like these deals are kind of never over. So, for example, when deals were made, you look at like the phase 1 trade agreement between the U.S. and China during the first Trump administration, that was the deal. And we didn't keep going back and negotiating and announcing new tariffs. I think this time around, all these deals are going to kind of be a work in progress, and there will be continued uncertainty and requests and demands as new tariffs are rolled out in the coming months, particularly under Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which are these sectoral national security tariffs that are around the corner. We've all heard of tariffs coming on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, but there are many other 232s that people aren't talking about, which also could result in tariffs. And just yesterday, the president announced a new Section 232 investigation into wind turbines. So I think that brings into there are about 10 or so outstanding 232 investigations.
Thanks for that. Maybe we'll come back to those sectoral tariff questions. But I want to turn to Kurt now. Emeritus now, chair, something like that. Kurt also has, like Wendy, about 3 decades of experience working with the U.S. government. But I wanted to turn to sort of your business and economic acumen in this question and talk about the investment aspect of this deal. How do you see that playing out? Is this realistic to think about 550 billion or wherever they landed on the whiteboard in the Oval Office there? And which, it sounds like there was an emphasis on energy, on semiconductors, on critical minerals, these areas that are particularly important for U.S. economic security. But how do you see all of that playing out in the months and years to come?
Yeah, thank you, and it's always both a pleasure and some schooling sitting with Wendy when we're talking about trade. She and I used to tag team the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation operation for the U.S. government, and I was usually the good cop, right? Most of the time. There's certain topics where I was a bad cop, but today I'm going to be like Debbie Downer, and be a little bit dark about the situation, but starting with a description of why I think we're going through this, what I think is still an ongoing crisis in U.S.-Japan relations, is that the president has several goals that all relate to trade and tariffs. He wants tariffs themselves for revenue purposes and is very proud of the revenue that's raised through tariffs. So tariffs will be high at the end of the Trump administration, and perhaps continue to go up throughout the administration. He wants to use tariffs to coerce, strong word but accurate, foreign companies to invest more in the United States. And by doing so, combination of this, the theory is that it will reduce the trade deficits, although I think that's a residual that won't be realized through this policy. And then finally, the tariffs provide the president with a tool of leverage that he can use in a variety of ways that are both trade-related or non-trade related. 50% tariff on Brazil because it's prosecuting its former president. Threats of high tariffs on Cambodia and Thailand if they don't stop shooting. In that case, it was a very useful thing, utilization of that leverage, and actually resulted in a ceasefire. But so this is not going to go away with one agreement, is I think my first point and sort of lasting point. And whether this boils over into a lasting long-term crisis in U.S.-Japan relations will be something we're just going to have to wait and see, and depend upon the management both of the trade issue and other related issues. Another point is that Japan is, as Wendy was saying, Japan's in good company here, or rough company, in being treated roughly the same way as the European Union, Korea, Taiwan, Canada, other advanced industrial economies, with a high tariff combined with expectations of massive investments into the United States. And so the EU, Korea, Taiwan agreement's not done, but there will be pledges of large-scale investment into the U.S. have all made these commitments. So that's somewhat comforting, I think, for Japan, that they're in the same boat. But that boat is one of the proverb is same bed, different dreams. In this case, I guess it's like same boat, different dreams, where you're in the same boat with other countries and with the United States, but it's like a canoe where people are paddling in different directions. And the U.S. government is saying out loud that essentially Japan is going to give them $550 billion cash that the U.S. government will be able to distribute around the country, which is, the president personally, which is not, obviously not going to happen. I think that would be unconstitutional for Japan to do, and would result.
Probably for us too.
Probably for us too. But that's on one end, and on the other end, Japan thinks that it did so with great care and thoughtfulness, that it has made pledges to increase investment in the United States and use Japanese government jawboning and to a certain degree Japanese government financing, concessional financing, loan guarantees and the like to boost the pace of Japanese investment in the United States in sectors of high priority, which is potentially a win-win, especially when the U.S. and Japan are combining forces to meet a perceived threat of China's rise and China's leverage on the global trade and investment stage. So the idea of the Japanese government helping Japanese companies do more in the U.S. on semiconductors or on advanced biotech or various manufacturing or things like energy or shipbuilding, although Japan's very reluctant on that, and I think is sensible in being reluctant on that. That those areas, that there is some logic behind that, but I think it's going to take a really long time to sort this out. And meanwhile, I think there's a high chance that the U.S. is going to threaten additional tariffs or raise or rip up the agreement. That's a strong word. Drag things out and use the tariff leverage in order to try and maximize advantage on this foreign direct investment piece. So it's a little bit dark interpretation of what's going on, but it's maybe ever so slightly exaggerated for effect, but I'm not sure that it is. So I think this group should be aware of that and think about what the implications are for the relationship more broadly.
Thanks for that, I think, Kurt. Just to wrap up this tariff thing specifically, because we have so many business folks in the room who are interested, which are the sectors that are the most vulnerable for Japan? Like and as Wendy has said, this is going to continue to roll out. Are there particular areas that Japan and this room need to know about to flag?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll start with auto and auto parts, which, comprises a disproportionate share of Japan's exports to the U.S. and its GDP. So that sector in particular is hard hit. And again, we've agreed on tariff reductions, but as far as I know, they still have not gone into effect. So right now, Japan is paying the 27.5% tariff on auto and auto parts imports. Second, I think semiconductors and related equipment. And here I would just say, you're going to hear like the Section 232 on semiconductors, right? And the president's talking about tariffs like in the hundreds of percents. But he's also talking maybe, he would provide an exception for companies that announce new investments in the United States. I don't know how that would be implemented. But what I want to draw your attention to on these 232s, even though it says semiconductors, the scope of product coverage could be extensive to cover what are called a lot of derivative products. And we've seen that already with the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are also impacting Japan. And here, just this past week, new products were added to that list, including hairspray in metal containers and baby booster seats. So on semiconductors, folks are saying maybe iPhones would be covered and a lot of other electronic products. So the scope of these sectoral tariffs could be much broader. And frankly, if indeed the reciprocal tariffs, which have been implemented under IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, if that is indeed overturned by the courts, you may see more and more dependence on other statutes to impose tariffs, including Section 232. So, and put that on the table. But then, lots of there's 232 investigations on pharmaceuticals and trucks and drones and aircraft and all types of products. So I think for this audience, I would be paying attention to kind of the whole range of products.
Just to foot stomp the pattern here of announcing high tariffs on a broad-ranging basis and then implementing numerous exceptions to that. which have already been, we've already seen that on autos. We've seen it on the Canada and Mexico tariffs. We've seen it on the sort of cell phone electronics area, and now on semiconductors. And so I think the difficulty of that approach is it makes it extraordinarily confusing for corporations to figure out whether they're going to be in accepted categories or be in covered categories. And the exceptions can be decided rather quickly and based on good logic. For example, there are some things that might see a tariff applied, and then a couple days later, someone says, oh, by the way, we don't make these things in the United States, and we never will, and therefore charging a tariff is just inflationary and a tax. Let's get rid of that. And so then that gets rid of that, and that confusion and constant shifting benchmarks makes it harder to actually realize the goal of leveraging the size of the U.S. market to use protectionism to force reindustrialization of the United States.
And before I give it back to you, I'd just say these exclusions these product exclusions are being offered in a very, let's just say, non-transparent way. During Trump 1.0, for example, when steel tariffs were put in, the Commerce Department was leading a process whereby companies would come in, request exclusions, experts would look at them and grant them or not grant them or partially grant them. Now it seems to me like exclusions are granted based on a good meeting or good phone call between the president and a CEO. And so this also makes it more confusing. The president may announce there's an exclusion, but then the company, who's looking at the tariff, at the tariff schedules and trying to figure out what tariff they need to incur. And many times, what the president says hasn't really been translated into concrete tariff breaks. So I really echo what Kurt is saying. It's a very confusing time for companies to just figure out what their tariff is, and also to figure out how to adjust their supply chains to such an unpredictable and evolving situation where, different countries have different tariff rates for different products that are changing day to day. And that is really presenting huge challenges to companies, and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have, all those customs experts sitting on, floor 29 of their building, sifting through this, or using, big law firms to help them do this. So I really hope, but I'm not confident, that over time, they'll more certainty, at least with respect to the current tariff schedule, will be available for our companies as they try and kind of cope with this unpredictable environment.
I just want to take a bit of a step back now that we've sort of drilled down into these details. With these sorts of trade deals and somewhat punishing tariffs on Japan, are we driving Japan to seek to bolster their ties with other countries? I mean, Japan is a leader even of the CPTPP, as well as the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So are there essentially other centers of economic gravity that Japan may turn to, given the outlines of this trade agreement? And as one of the chief negotiators of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, wonder how you see Japan maneuvering itself in this space now, Wendy.
Yeah, and look, this is a great question, and this is not just Japan. The activity among our partners to either conclude trade agreements among themselves or cooperation agreements or commercial agreements is really charged right now. And, every day you can pick up the press all around the country, see different leaders, different ministers visiting different countries, announcing new economic partnerships. And I think a lot of that is being spurred by U.S. actions and a real need and recognition by countries that they need to reduce their dependence on the U.S. market. And so that is happening real time. And just to be clear, when these deals are made without us, we do not get the benefits. So over time, many of these deals and partnerships are going to work against U.S. commercial and economic interests. So that would be number one. With respect to Japan in particular, yes, we are seeing increased activity. You know, a lot of back and forth with not only Asian trading partners in Southeast Asia, but with African countries. And I think we're all kind of watching what happens when Prime Minister Modi visits Japan in the next few days, after he visits China, by the way. And that's something, and we're not going to get into that right now, but, you know, if you want to, you know, talking about India just for a minute, I don't know what we're doing there, because, you know, you spend decades building these relationships, and boy, you can just, you know, destroy them in a matter of days. And guess what? You can't rebuild them in a matter of days. And, you know, the one other comment I would make, and I'm hearing this not only from some Japanese colleagues, but other colleagues, and that is that many of them viewed Trump 1.0 kind of as an aberration in our politics, kind of a one-off. And so when Biden came in and really wanted to recharge and refresh our alliances and partnerships, these other countries were all in, right? But now that we have Trump 2.0, and they're beginning to see a lot of those efforts now, day by day, being disassembled, I'm hearing that even if a new president were to come in 3.5 years, let's say, and was also equally just, you know, wanted to put a lot of emphasis and priority on rebuilding alliances and partnerships, that a lot of our partners and allies are not going to be all, you know, all in. That, you know, they recognize that, you know, 3-4 years later, another Trump-like person could come in with, again, not valuing these alliances. So I think what we're seeing now is a trend. And I'm not saying that, you know, our relations with all these countries are going to break. I think the U.S. Japan relationship is so solid. And it's not just leader to leader, right? And that's what, you know, an audience like this shows me. There's so many people who've spent decades working on this relationship from so many different parts of the United States, including, you know, businesses, but states and Congress, and all of that will, you know, hopefully continue. But, you know, just to kind of build on your dark theme, I think there are like medium to long-term consequences here. And, you know, we're going to be feeling them in the United States for decades to come.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and perhaps to amplify one aspect of it, some of the policy distancing or hedging or moving in other directions towards other countries among our friends and allies around the world, and this includes both Europe and Asia, is the same phenomenon is happening both in the economic realm as well as in the geopolitical realm. The question really is, just to foot stomp what Wendy said, is how long does the United States continue on the track that it's going? I'll put on professor hat here for a second. I think that looking at back 5, 6, 7 years from now, if the U.S. continues to be a sort of America first protectionist type approach to international trade and investment lasting to the end of this decade, then we might see the very difficult decisions being made by other countries to bring themselves together to the exclusion of the United States on a really systematic basis. Right now it's happening on an episodic basis. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Wendy, but on a systematic basis, which would mean, for example, the EU and the TPP countries getting together and creating essentially an alternative World Trade Organization that excludes both the United States and China, the two problem behemoths. Whether that happens or not, I think it's way too early to tell, and it depends upon whether the U.S. sustains this current approach. That's on the economic side. On the geopolitical side, I think a lot of the nations are confronting the fact that the U.S. is irreplaceable as an ally. And so you see simultaneously things happening like the Korean president making his first trip to overseas to Japan, putting aside historical differences and saying, hey, we got to work together because we need each other now more, given U.S. policy. You see that happening at the same time as Korea and Japan reaching out to the United States and trying really, really hard to make our military alliances and relationships even deeper simultaneously, full-on hedging strategy. But I think in recognition of the fact that if they don't have strong alliance relationships, geopolitical alliance relationships with the United States, they're in a difficult position and a dangerous one. And so I think that conversation is going to, I expect over the next few months and into next year, this group will hear a lot, not less about the trade and investment piece, but the alliance management aspects of all this are going to get more and more prominence. Folks in Beijing are going to test the boundaries here and see what they can do to try and weaken the alliance relationships that the United States has spent decades building. So that is another aspect of this that people should really be keeping their eyes on.
Yeah, and before I give it back to you, just to footstop on what Kurt said, I mean, just watch China now. I mean, Beijing must be thinking like, wow, what a gift that keeps giving. And they're really trying to woo a lot of countries into their orbit. That said, I don't see that happening like, big time, that all of a sudden our allies and partners are now going to just move to the China camp. But they're going to hedge, and they're going to find those areas where they can work with China. And Beijing may also become more sophisticated and learn how to woo them, more effectively. I mean, China does make a lot of blunders. And right now, for example, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are really increasing their ties with Beijing. But what I would watch is Beijing is their exports to the U.S. going down. And where are they going? A lot of them are going to Southeast Asia. And, a lot of them are intermediates for other products, but a lot are finished products as well, as China needs to get rid of its excess capacity. So many Southeast Asian countries now are very worried about this influx of Chinese imports, which is leading them to impose some of their own trade restrictions. So the point I just want to leave, it's not like a black or white here, but I think we're just going to see just a lot more activity with countries hedging and different groups of countries coming together on different issues to kind of build closer and stronger ties.
Thank you for steering it more into my area of security. I was going to do it anyway, but you led me into that. Just as the moderator here, I echo a lot of those sentiments. I mean, we are seeing, I guess it's episodic, but it's an ad hoc, but it's happening so quickly that other countries are sort of joining forces. I mean, the Korea-Japan one is particularly notable, given under the first administration, that relationship was really troubled. And it does seem like even the progressive government in Seoul and the government in Tokyo are figuring out that they need to coordinate their actions here. They face a lot of the same challenges. Similarly, in the security world, Prime Minister Ishiba has suggested that Japan should join the ANZUS, the Australia-New Zealand-U.S. treaty. We're seeing India and Japan close and, deepen their already fairly close ties in really meaningful ways. So I just think generally we're going to see this trend of Japan diversifying all of its security and economic partnerships. And Wendy and I were on a panel focused on the U.S.-Korean alliance about a month ago, and noting that, You know, we used to sort of have, okay, we're going to talk about econ in this session, and we're going to talk about security in this session, and we shouldn't have done that then, and we definitely can't do that now. Like, these are deeply, deeply intertwined. So we've sort of gone to these grand themes, but I also want to talk specifically on the U.S. Japan alliance. Do you think we do have burden sharing negotiations, the so-called special measures agreement negotiations on the horizon now? The assumption is that this administration is going to ask for Japan to contribute more. How much pressure do you think that's going to put on the relationship? Do you think that Japan is ready to give more? And should they expect any sort of concessions given that they did get to this trade deal? Do you
Give that to Kurt.
So I think the specific, for folks who aren't familiar with this, the specific burden sharing agreement that Emma's referencing is the one where Japan, somewhat inappropriately, and not the government, calls it the Omoyeri Yosan, the contribution to the cost of maintaining American military presence in Japan, and it goes into various categories of expenditure, and does help defray the expense of having extensive U.S. military presence there. Doesn't defray the major costs, which are equipment and salaries, but it does help a lot with the basing costs, and that has been a political football back and forth between the countries for decades. I actually think the conversation being, as we were just describing, Emma, is broader now, and that the burden sharing conversation may be something that the president focuses on and highlights, because he does have a very transactional kind of bean counting approach to things. But I think it'll end up being overshadowed by the broader discussions about what we need to be doing collectively between the U.S. and Japan in terms of overall basing strategy, overall weapons acquisition, overall budgeting, deployment, plans related to Taiwan contingencies, the realignment of Japan's own forces in the direction of air and sea capabilities in a more southerly direction, closer to China rather than in other directions. So a whole lot of things are happening simultaneously in the alliance relationship, and most of it's good. And Japan has gone beyond the point of being badgered a lot to spend a little. Now it's being badgered a lot, but actually anticipating that and making its own decisions, using its own political decision-making capabilities and capital to proactively expand defense capability. And so the situation right now on this is unfortunately the U.S. being a land of tweeters and stuff, want everything to be their idea. And even though Japan is doing the right thing, the Americans want to yammer at them publicly and tell them to do what they're already planning on doing. And that's, to use a technical term, pissing off the Japanese government. And so that's kind of where we are right now on that conversation. I think there's going to be some tough words given back and forth over the coming months on this issue, and it'd probably end up in a decent place, actually, with the Japan on its own saying, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're not going to do, and have that be supported by the Japanese people as well. So I don't think the burden sharing thing is actually going to be a big enough irritant in that conversation, although it will be irritating to derail things. There's a lot of things the U.S. and Japan need to do, and there's shared responsibility to change the way that the defense industrial cooperation takes place. I won't get into the details, but it has a lot to do with how the State Department licenses exports, how U.S. defense companies share industrial processes, how Japan contracts with its own defense companies, issues like security clearance management and things like that. A lot of things need to get fixed, and they need to get fixed quickly. I'm actually optimistic that the attention to that is going to be sufficient to make a lot of progress.
Well, that's a lot of words and a lot of foot stomping from inside the Beltway, but would love to have the chance to gather a couple of questions from the audience on any of the topics we've broached here or neglected to bring up. Margo? I don't know if we have an additional mic, but I'm happy to share mine. Thanks.
Thank you. Assuming I should just identify myself, I'm Margo Carrington, retired U.S. public diplomacy officer. My last tour in Tokyo was the 4th, on the board of NAJAS, and also here representing Japan-America Society of the great state of North Carolina. So actually 2 questions. I mean, one from a messaging standpoint, and of course that's how I think of things as a public diplomacy officer. I'm reminded of when Biden came in, his first overseas trip was to Europe, and he carried the message of America is back. And the more astute European leaders said, yes, but for how long? And I think I'd just like to hear a little bit more of, you know, what could we all be doing to help counter that message that we're really retreating. And secondly, and sorry, I hope this is not too much in the weeds, but a surprising thing happened on the tour that our host here in Kentucky organized for us to go to the plant at Toyota, which is the largest Toyota plant in the world. They told us we were supposed to meet with Toyota executives, and this did not happen. So this came from a tour guide who told us that as of 2026, all Lexus models are going to be entirely produced in Japan. And I was absolutely knocked over by that comment, because as we know, Toyota is quite astute about all these issues, and wondered if you'd heard anything like that. But you know, what would you expect the Japanese to keep doing in terms of that foreign direct investment here in the U.S. To improve their situation, I guess?
Did you mean Lexus totally made in the U.S. or in Japan?
They're going to make all, what they told me was they're going to make all Lexus models entirely in Japan as of next year.
That was not a senior source.
It was not, that's what I did try and couch it that way. Yeah, I tried to you know, just pitch it that way, and I questioned a couple of times. We didn't have access to anybody else. So maybe we should just, you know, steer clear of that, but if it's true, it's quite surprising.
Let's collect a few questions, actually, and then, because we don't have a ton of time. Yes, Mike.
I have a security-oriented question. Since the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard have been playing bumper cars off of the Philippines, I understood that the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force was going to deploy more forces to South Philippines or to assist the Philippines. Is that correct? Do you know any intentions going forward for Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force deployments?
Any other question? Press them all together. Oh, here we go. Oh, Mike. Yes. Okay, you can stand it over. Thank you.
Jim Gannon with Peace Wins America. I was shocked, I think it was last week, it's hard to tell time anymore, but when European leaders staged an intervention in the White House on Ukraine policy. And so I'm curious, do you get a sense that sort of under the radar, have there been talks between Japan, EU, Canada, Mexico, other major economies on how to present a unified front on tariffs and other trade policy? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Okay, last question, then we'll try
Jamie
and
Kelly
tackle them all.
from CIA US, thanks Emma. And obviously not a CIA US related question, but a Navy related question. How does this administration now and then get away with reporting the no money at all paid for their defense for our forces and our bases over in Japan? The numbers just don't come out of what they're really doing. And it's bothersome.
Great. I can turn to the panelists. On the Philippines question, I don't know the specifics, but certainly the Japan and the Philippines, that's one of the partnerships that's really deepened. And it was trilaterally as well with the United States. So I would look for more and more cooperation on that front, and particularly in the maritime sphere.
So I'll take, how about I take the security questions, you take, no, only kidding. So first on autos, first of all, I would just recommend whoever from Toyota said that, like they just keep quiet, because that's something you kind of don't want to be made public, right? And I was a bit surprised because I thought you meant to say that they're going to make them in the U.S. I think what's happening for U.S. auto producers right now, they are at a disadvantage vis-a-vis Japan when the new tariffs come in, the EU and Korea when their new tariffs come in, and that is because U.S. auto suppliers are paying high tariffs for inputs. So for example, for steel and aluminum, they're paying 50% tariffs, and that's really jacking up their prices. So U.S. auto companies now are complaining that Japan and the EU and Korea cars are going to be more competitive than cars made in the U.S. And so hopefully that is being worked on somewhere in the administration. And then I would just say, Jim, you asked a question about, the countries working, uniting on this tariff and the tariff issue and these trade agreements. Look, what struck me through all of these negotiations over the 90 days, it was kind of every country for himself or herself, right? Because everyone is, they kind of have their own interests, their own equities, and frankly, they're competing against other countries. So for example, once Japan did a deal, Korea had to do a deal. But Korea thought it was going to get a better deal than Japan because after all, it was a free trade agreement partner. That didn't happen. And one of the things I always say publicly, but just want to share here, if you're an FTA partner of the United States, so Korea, Australia, Singapore, Peru, they were at a disadvantage in these negotiations. Why do I say that? Because their tariffs were already at 0, so they had no more to give on that front. While like in India or a Vietnam or a Cambodia could reduce their high tariffs and get credit for that. So not only did our FTA partners kind of lose their advantage, but I would argue they were disadvantaged. And so if you want to talk to some angry countries, and some of them keep it private for me, yeah, there's a lot of anger, and I don't even think pissed off would even, kind of work here. It's much more deep-seated. But again, I think it was every country kind of for him or herself. But now that the deals are in effect, or many of them are, or have been concluded, I think you're going to see more efforts, not among countries, not just to work on their own trade agreements among themselves, but also to try and coordinate more. But again, this is really difficult. Malaysia's really trying to do this within ASEAN with very little success. But, maybe over time we might see more of that. But again, I think each country has their own equities, is going to be very reluctant to be part of a group, where Trump can turn around, like with the BRICS group, and just say, okay, I'm hitting you all with another 25% tariff. So who knows? Over to you.
Thanks. Just a couple quick points, and then I want to say something about this network in this context, because we're wrapping up, right? Yeah. So on the Toyota thing, my guess is that if that person continued into another paragraph or knew what they were talking about, they would say, and we're shifting all production of all Camrys to the United States. So companies just change product lines and where they manufacture things based upon efficiency decisions internally. So I think I wouldn't actually read anything into that. The various our company did a report showing how much different companies produce in autos in the United States versus in Mexico and Canada versus in their home countries. It's on our website if you're really interested in this. It's quite complicated which companies are most disadvantaged and which are most advantaged by the autos tariffs. And one of the reasons why the autos tariffs might not have come out yet, and Wendy knows this, is that the U.S. companies import more from Canada and Mexico, and so they're actually worried that they're going to have a higher tariff than the Japanese and Korean companies, given the way things have played out. On the South China Sea piece, Emma's correct, but there's a line a fine line that Japan is walking here, where they are doing much more than before. Their most recent equipment sale to the Philippines was didn't have guns on the decks, but there were Navy ships. They were not like non-Navy ships that are going to be retooled into being Coast Guard ships. So both on the military sales thing and on the joint action efforts, Japan's leaning forward more than before, and my guess is that will continue to evolve. But it is not yet going to be in the direction of Japan being a treaty ally of the Philippines or being in a shooting position. I do go back to one of my experiences riding around on an aircraft carrier. It was a fun day, and you're on the aircraft carrier here, and the Chinese ship's over there watching, and then the Japanese ships over there and the Australian ships back there, and that collective action thing feels really good for the countries that are doing that collective action, which actually brings me to the joint action, collective action question and my broader message for you all. So you see, like, because they just absolutely are worried about Russia, and they're putting their own troops in, and they're leaning farther forward than the United States, you see European countries coming in. But they're doing that carefully and because they must. And more often, collective action to stop, counter what the U.S. administration has been doing lately, and I think this conveys to domestic policy as well as international, is something that scares the heck out of people, right? Because the administration does choose targets to deter collective action. So has there been an Ivy League pushback? There has not, right? It's been university by university in that sphere of activity. And so I think in the trade area, I think Wendy's right. It may cross over into collective action, but it won't be that obvious in the first instances, and it'll be very carefully done, which gets me to my broader point. So one observation, and some people might not like to hear this observation, is that our friends in the Japanese corporate sector, to a certain extent in the government, less so, but in the corporate sector, are still kind of in a state of shock about what's happening in this situation. And the collective action effort is not visible to me in a powerful way, utilizing the full resources of a network of companies that employ 1 million people in the United States directly and several million more by extension, including in places like Kentucky. So I think it's really fitting what Andy's done in our theme this year, Japan America is working, and in the messaging of this group going forward, to help provide a mood music, or a background message which is proactive but not confrontational, because confrontation will lead to reaction and also not be supported by our friends. If this group were to say, we're really angry about this, let's do a NAJAS resolution against the U.S. government on its trade policy, 2/3 of you would agree with it, 1/3 would not. We would pass it, and then we would become a target have a target painted on our foreheads. But there's another message which can be put out, which is there's nothing wrong with the way things are going now, and it's of value. And so, and as anyone in the United States considers the U.S.-Japan relationship, they should take care and realize what we've got, and it's good, and it needs to be recognized, and just trumpet success as the message rather than challenge the attacks on that success would be my recommendation for y'all in the messaging going forward. I think that's where Andy's been steering things, and in the guise of Japan-America societies, it's actually a fairly safe space to be doing that indirect positive messaging that doesn't seem confrontational at all, would be my encouraging point.
So you're saying I shouldn't table a resolution now? Okay, okay.
Well, read it to us. What did you
Okay. I hope you learned a lot from this panel. I think, I mean, it's basically what Kurt just said, but when you have this sort of challenges and turbulence broadly, geopolitically, and somewhat in the bilateral relationship, it's all the more important to nurture these grassroots societies and for you to do the work that you're already doing to amplify the good relations that we have at this more very meaningful person-to-person level. So with that, we'll conclude this panel and get on with the rest of the program. Thank you.
Emma, thank you so much for putting this amazing panel together.